So this is the prayer that I used to start my class, and I thought we could use it to start this talk as well. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Grant, O merciful God, that I may ardently desire, prudently examine, truthfully acknowledge, and perfectly accomplish what is pleasing to Thee, for the praise and glory of Thy name, amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit, amen. Before I get into the talk proper, I wanted to just follow up on some items from last lecture, particularly with my moon and my tree project. Now with the moon, I guess with the tree project, they have to track the sun, at least take measurements of where it is above the horizon and the compass direction, and that'll change over 11 weeks. And about halfway through the semester, I show them this picture that I hope is next. That if you took a picture of the sun at the same time every day, it would trace out this, what's called an analemma pattern in the sky. And so somebody did this at Notre Dame, and so this would be the winter solstice, right? This would be the summer solstice, and then these would be the equinoxes. If you're in the southern hemisphere, it's inverted so that the big part of the figure 8 is on the top. So it's interesting for them to get a sense of, right, they're tracking, depending on the semester, right, some aspect of this curve. So it gives them the sense of they're doing something that has a broader pattern that they're a part of. So that's the first. The next is I just want to show a video. It's a Buick commercial that I first saw during a Notre Dame away game. It was a commercial, because I can. All right, so volume, it's duplicated, right?
I'll take him for a ride in the Buick.
Buick introduces the refined new SUV that's anything but a snooze to drive. The first ever Buick Envision. A joy to drive, a joy to share. And yes, it's a Buick.
All right, what did you think? You want to get a Buick? Did you notice anything false in that commercial? I'll play it again.
I'll take him for a ride in the Buick.
Buick introduces the refined new SUV that's anything but a snooze to drive. The first ever Buick Envision. A joy to drive, a joy to share. And yes, it's a Buick.
All right, any thoughts? It is the moon.
And yes,
so let's go back and look at the moon.
Buick Envision. A joy to drive, a joy to share. The first ever Buick Envision.
All right, what's wrong with this moon? So it's waxing. It's almost a first quarter moon, so it's a waxing crescent. And what time do waxing crescents set? Certainly before, this is after 4:29. It's probably 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock. So certainly before that time. But if you don't know the waxing crescent moon set at 2 in the morning or so, you could also know that the moon is illuminated on the side that faces the sun. The sun is coming up, right? You would think over in the left-hand side of the screen, right? And so the moon it's all. And so I show this about a month after we've done the moon project, and I show this commercial, and I say now you have a marketable skill that you can detect, errors of people's photoshopping of screens and things. Somebody asked me that in class, and I said, yes. I've been looking at the moon intentionally for 30 years, 35 years, and you can tell, right? You get used to the phases, and you know what can be up when and where. And, all right, so here's the logos for today. It's in the animal kingdom, an arthropod, class Insecta, order Coleoptera, which are the beetles, family Cuculionidae, the weevils. I think this is Odeorhynchus sulcatus. And here's the creature. I wanted to take a picture that was something that I saw like yesterday or this morning, but with the rain, I haven't really seen much. And I wanted to use an animal of some kind. So this was last year at this time. This is what I saw on the sidewalk before this lecture. It's the dark vine weevil, which is a pest of gardens and crops. So that's the logos of the day. For today, we're going to talk about evolution. 5 different parts. I'll try and go quickly through the first 2, and then spend most of the time on 3 and 5, maybe a little bit on 4 if there's time, but we can jump over that since John O'Callaghan has given us some things about chance. So we'll talk about evolution, divine action, Paley, intelligent design and the new atheists, divine providence and chance, and then human evolution. So what is evolution? I think you may have, in your preparation for this week, you read Theodosius Dobzhansky's Nothing in Biology Makes Sense Except in the Light of Evolution. Is that something that was part of the packet, right? So for those who went to the DVT and saw All Creation Gives Praise in Jordan Hall, if you went through the large, it's technically not called an atrium, they call it something else, the Galleria, I think. On the floor are 3 medallions repeated once. And for the biology, they have biology, chemistry, and physics. And for the biology, they have a DNA molecule, and around the outside, right, is Dobzhansky's 1972 article that you read, Nothing in Biology Makes Sense Except in the Light of Evolution. So students who are walking across this, right, if they stop and read it, can get this sense of the central significance that the theory of evolution plays in any biology that they're doing. And one of the points of Dobzhansky's article, right, amazing geneticist, he was part of the modern synthesis in the 1930s, right? Darwin, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, had fallen into disrepair in a sense, right? He had no method to account for natural selection. For him, it was just a black box. And it wasn't until the modern synthesis when embryology and paleontology and genetics all come together to create what's called neo-Darwinism, or the modern synthesis. And Dobzhansky was one of the population geneticists, one of the main forces behind that synthesis. Right, and in that article he talks about homology, as in contrast to analogy. So homologous structures depicted here, right, of a turtle, a dolphin, a human, a horse, and a bird and a bat, right? The bones, though they differ in structure, all have a presumed, right, phylogenetic relationship with one another, that they come from a common ancestor and they've been modified over time, evolutionarily, to do different functions, right? The fossorial, we don't have a, well, if you had like a mole or something, things that dig, right, the fossorial, right? So the structure and the function, dolphins need different shaped arms and hands, what we call as a hand, right, arms, 4 limbs, to do what they do to go through water versus a horse that's walking on the ground. But the point is that the colors, right, indicate the similarities of, these are the same, they have the same origin. So they are homologous. They have a common ancestor that's related, that relates them to one another. So homology is an important term that we have to think about when we get to human evolution. And the other term would be analogy. So analogy would be that where there's not a direct evolutionary relationship. So we can think about the bird, the wing of a bat, and the wing of an insect, like that beetle that I just showed. Right? They both fly, they both have wings, but they've come from different independent origins. So they're analogous structures. There's not a direct relationship where they had a common ancestor that structure comes from. So analogy, independent origins, homology, a common ancestor with diversification. And evolution can explain why these structures are this way, right? That's one of the points of Dobzhansky's article, is evolution makes sense of all these different phenomena that we see out in the world. Or why, I think this is from South Africa somewhere, organisms that are living today are related to the fossils of that place. Evolution can explain why that would be the case. Or to think about, why do whale bones have femurs? Right? Because evolutionarily they derived from a land animal that had walking limbs, right? And it changes over time. Right? Evolution can make sense of that. This is a pitcher plant, right? Carnivorous plants that live in bogs right, where they're very nitrogen deficient, so the pitcher plants have a phytotelma. There's liquid inside that insects fall in. There's hairs that keep them from calling out, and then they get dissolved by that water and absorbed into the plant. That's how it gets its nitrogen. It doesn't. There's a type of mosquito, the pitcher plant mosquito, Wyomia smithii, that the only place it lives is in the water of the pitcher plant. It's a special adaptation. Dobzhansky would say something like that. He uses examples of bacteria that dissolve oil spills and things, but this would be an example that I'm familiar with of the specific adaptation for a species to live within the environment of another. Right? And evolution can give an explanation for that. Where the distribution, this goes back to biogeography that I somewhat touched on yesterday's lecture of right when all the continents were together and those animals are separated then through continental drift and can explain the distribution of organisms in those places evolutionarily. Right? So evolution is an example of, is a process that can explain why those animals and their fossils are distributed the way they are. Or the unity of life is central for Dobzhansky's article, right? There's one, all life is interrelated with one another. It's all interconnected. Right? DNA, the homologies of chromosomes. So you can have homology not just of gross anatomical structures, but also of molecular homology. Right? So I think he used an example of cytochrome C in his article, and the amino acid sequences that are chickens are more closely related to us than yeast, right? The cytochrome of a yeast versus a chicken, there'll be more differences between us and a yeast cytochrome versus a chicken. And evolution can explain that, right? It gives a reason for it. So that's all I wanted to say about what is evolution, right? It's just descent with modification. It's the change in allele frequency over time. It's the basic definition of evolution. Natural selection is a method of how that change takes place. There are other processes than natural selection, though, right? Genetic drift and such. Divine action in the world, just to recap, that hopefully is what has been emphasized over and over again, primary and secondary causation. There's a cactus from out in Arizona, and the flowering and pollination of that plant you could study as a botanist or as an ecologist, and you could come up with the natural causes for it, but that in no way eliminates the divine cause of what's giving it being, and that's the cause of the existence of that plant and those insects, but also the cause of the causes, right? It's the divine cause, the primary cause, is the cause of those secondary causes that scientists study. John O'Callaghan said in one of his answers to his questions, I think it was Professor Baglow's question about what is human nature and such, and he went through Aristotle's 4 causes. So I just wanted to, for those that, so we're all on the same page, I use this in class, it's a fun little cartoon to talk about the 3 pigs and what are the causes of these houses, right? So the material cause is what it's made of, right? Straw, wood, or bricks. The efficient cause is the pigs as the carpenters, the workmen, the work pigs that make it. The formal cause is, well, what kind of thing did they build? They didn't have to build houses. They could have built, I don't know, a school. They could have built a church. They could have built, right? They built houses, right? It has the form of a house. So that's part of the cause. And then the final cause is for what ends? Why did they make these houses, right? For security, for shelter. They could have made it to win an architecture prize, right? But they made it for protection from the big bad wolf, right? So that's the material, the efficient, the formal, and the final cause. And God can have all of those except the material, right? Because God's not material. Suppose if you think about the incarnation, you might get into the material cause of things, but it's through the humanity of Christ. But God, right, just as pure spirit, can be an efficient cause of creation, right? The cause of existence. He's the formal cause, the logos, through which everything, he's the form of creation. The formal cause, and then the final cause would be the Holy Spirit as for what end, right? This goodness. So just know that we can talk about causes, whether at the natural level or the divine level. So that's all I want to say about divine action. So we're done parts 1 and 2, and now we're into 3. See, we're flying through these things. Now we're going to slow down a little bit. and talk about William Paley, intelligent design, and I should change the slide and say the intelligent design movement, because it can be confusing, and the new atheists. So this is my great-grandfather's pocket watch. It no longer works. It's too expensive to get fixed. And Paley's argument, right, back in 1802 or so, is you're walking in the woods and you come across a pocket watch on the ground. And what can you conclude from that? And his argument was, well, given its complexity, its structure, it has all the parts working together, right, if it were a working pocket watch. And he says, well, just by coming across this, you would think that somebody must have made this. There must be a clock maker, given its organization and its structure and its design. The design points to a designer. What do you think of that argument? Because then he's going to apply that to the universe and to biological organisms. That the universe has a certain design, so there must be a designer of the universe. Or you come across a pig or a dark vine weevil, black vine weevil, and you're going to say, well, it's got organization and complexity and design. There must be a designer of the weevil, and we're going to call that God. What do you think of that? We can just leave that as a rhetorical question. I'm going to say I don't like it at all. And that's going to be what I'll talk about following up, and what's wrong with this way of going as an argument for God's existence. So just to put Paley in context, so shortly after Paley was Huxley, and also Ernst Haeckel, and as science is coming about, right, the word science isn't coined until 1833. William Whewell coins it in 1833. You start to get the rise of scientific societies in the 19th century. And Thomas Huxley didn't want certain groups of people in these scientific societies. He didn't want women. Now, we've talked about women, right, in science. He didn't want women. And he didn't want clergy. He didn't want pastors. Right? So it's part of this beginning of this antagonism between science and religion, right? Ernst Haeckel, this great proponent of Darwinian evolution, but he's also an avid atheist, and he's promoting his atheism through natural selection and Darwinism, and we'll talk about that. So in the midst of the beginning of the 19th century, when Paley is active, he's in the context of René Descartes, and a mechanization of organisms is taking place. And William Paley belongs to a group of people called the physico-theologians. Physico, the physico-theologians. So he and John Ray, and they attempt to refute atheism by pointing to design in nature as an argument for God's existence. Right, so in 1802, he writes Natural Theology, or Evidences of the Existence and Attributes of the Deity Collected from the Appearances of Nature. But it's all within the context of René Descartes. And he's taken this Aristotelian understanding of what organisms are. Right? To be a body is to be a living organism. A dead body is a contradiction in terms. For Aristotle, the basic units of reality are a dark vine beetle, are a sycamore tree, right? It's not the periodic table. It is for us today in the 21st century, the basic units of reality, right, are quarks and bosons and, right, the quantum physics view of the world and the periodic table. That matter is inert stuff. And this is the fruits of a mechanization, the Cartesian way of looking at the world. The basic units are hydrogen, helium, boron, carbon. Matter is inert, it's deprived of principles of inherent activity. Organic beings, for Descartes, get reduced to machines, right? For him, dogs are machines. They're mechanical. The inherent purposiveness, how do you say this, purposiveness of things is taken away. If you have a jaguar and it sees an antelope, right, it's going to go after it. Right? Jaguars are the true automobiles. Right? Our cars are not automobiles. Right? They don't self-move. We move them. Right? But animals and plants, they're self-moving. They're self-directed towards some end. But all that gets eliminated with a Cartesian mechanization of organisms to machines. So matter itself is not thought of as living. And in that fourfold causality of Aristotle, what people who are now starting to do science, natural philosophy that's becoming science, final cause and formal cause are going to be seen as superfluous. And the only ones that really matter are material cause and particularly efficient cause. What's the cause of something? Well, hydrogen and oxygen come together and make water. That's the context in which the physical theologians, primarily in Britain, are operating. And so you have people like Robert Boyle, right, founder of modern chemistry and Boyle's law, right, born in Ireland, philosopher, chemist, physicist. He wants to explain, using design being one of the best arguments to convince humans that there is a God. He critiques this Cartesian elimination of final causes. That is the explanation of terms of design from science. For what ends? Or Robert Hooke, right, an assistant to Boyle, who looked at microscopic organisms, right, and the gnat. To contemplate these creatures can only lead us to magnify the providence that so clearly works to bring them about, he says. Right? It's all about design and organization. But what they've done is they've received this Cartesian philosophy without question. And so they want to hold on to teleology and design, but it can't come from the inside anymore from the organisms. It has to come from outside. Because a machine, if you have a machine, the machine doesn't do anything on its own, but a mechanic or somebody created it. Right? So the designer now is extrinsic to the organism. Oh, there's Robert Hooke. Though he was talking about gnats, that's actually a flea. Right? According to the word cell, right? Based on a monastic cell, not a prisoner cell. So I think what's wrong with the Paley argument? The first thing is that it's looking at design and trying to point that as a reason for God's existence. But they're no longer operating within a Christian framework. Scholars have suggested that they're using now more of a Stoic viewpoint. Instead of looking at it from a Christian point of view, where we talked about God giving existence to things, right, creation, the Stoic view of creation focused on a teleological order and design of nature. So the Stoics back in the 4th to 3rd century BC had this idea that only matter exists. There's a fundamental material nature of reality, but the source of the order of that reality, of that material reality, is a providential designing, capital N, nature. And so these British physical theologians and scientists, they're not intentionally doing this, but they are just substituting God, in essence, for where nature was for the Stoics. They're putting in God. So it has much more of a connection with Stoic philosophy than it does with a Christian view that emphasizes God as the creator of everything ex nihilo. This ontological focus, a focus on being, shifts to organization at some historical moment. It's a concern with teleological ordering. But is order the real issue? Is it the ordering that's important, or that the thing exists even to begin with? If creation is solely understood as ordering of material chaos by a deity, acting in time as this, in some sense, intervening demiurge, then the design arguments of of Paley and John Ray can be called into question. Because what's going on is there's a word that has come up in terms of primary and secondary causation that is a word I don't like with a theological view of who God is, and that's intervention. And this is, Professor Callahan was talking about this in terms of miracles. And I don't think God intervenes in the world. He talked about, well, the incarnation could be an intervention. And the reason I don't like the word intervention, and I'll talk more about this when we get to intelligent design, is if you're going to intervene, you can only intervene where you're not already present. And God is everywhere. God is the cause of everything that's happening. This is where Professor Callahan was talking about, don't lose the sense of the wonder of the providential ordering of things and that things exist in themselves, because God is the existence of that weevil on the sidewalk. We don't have to look for moments where only God could be doing it and not nature. Because if you have a sense of primary and secondary causation, creation ex nihilo, and creatio continua, then everything that you see points to God. That's the whole point of a sacramental vision of reality. You don't have to look for particular joints. God's working here, because God's working everywhere. God's the cause of these lights shining right now. And that's the vision. How do we have that? And so the physical theologians are looking for God's operative just in the design. It's not just even the existence of the plant or the Wyomire smithii or the pitcher plant mosquito. It's that it exists at all. So it's reducing God, the physical theologians and Paley, it's reducing God to the level of a natural cause. It's making God, in some ways, a mechanic that's operating on the structures of reality to give it its order. Versus God being this transcendent cause who from all eternity has ordered the universe in his wisdom to do what it does and to give it its ability to act as it does. So they have a univocal view of God. God is one more thing in the universe, in a sense. He's one more cause in the world. God must intervene to design this machine organism. So it opens the door to treat natural and divine causes as competitors. And the whole point of primary and secondary causation that's been emphasized this week is that they act concurrently. They act at different metaphysical levels, and they're never in competition. The writing on the pen, the author, and the story, they're not in competition. So you have someone like David Hume, 1776, it's an easy year to remember for us in America. Right, Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion. And this is before Darwin, but he anticipates Darwin. And he says, well, what if matter contains the source or spring of order originally within itself? You think about organisms or the universe itself. What if matter can do things that you're attributing to a divine cause? What if matter can do it? What if natural causes can do it? Then I've just eliminated your God. Because they're in competition. And if you now have a natural cause, you no longer need the divine cause. And I think that's what's fundamentally at error with the Paley argument, with the clockmaker, is that it's reducing God to a univocal level with all other being and making it more like a natural cause than a divine cause. And it gets away from this fundamental idea of God being the creator of everything and giving it existence. So Darwin comes along, and Darwin hypothesizes the mechanism by which matter does do this kind of thing. This is how organisms function in the world. And this is how populations work, and species come about through this. I have a natural cause to explain why this weevil looks so organized and has the design that it is. Natural selection does it. It's not God. And Richard Dawkins will pick up on this. Right, there's Darwin. Richard Dawkins, right? So he writes the book in 1986, The Blind Watchmaker. But he has the same, right, I put up on, I don't know if it's, right? He has this univocal view of God. God is just one more thing in the world. It's not the cause of the existence of the world. And so Paley, Darwin, and Dawkins all share in this univocal view of God. The divine and natural causes are in competition with one another. Right? But it's a philosophical error, theological error, because God is not in competition with natural causes, that God is sustaining an existence. So that's the Paley part. And now I want to talk about intelligent design, and I should always say the intelligent design movement. Because they chose these words specifically, I think, to sow confusion. Because what Christian doesn't think that the world is intelligently designed? God has designed it in his wisdom, in his order, his logos. Right? So they're playing on that reality. But this is a specific term of art about the way that the world works. And I want to talk about Hot Wheels cars. You ever play with these when you were little? Uh-oh. Oh, well, so there's, I'm just going to turn this off. I'm going to go back to a video that I have lined up. Well, there it is, but it doesn't work from there. So I have this lined up to proper minute, and we're going to have some fun with this.
I've set the supercharger on 3/4 power.
Very important.
And I'll start running laps with the yellow Corvette. Later, I'll add the Copo Corvette into the circuit.
All right, enough of the music. So we had the superchargers as kids. I don't know if you did. Hopefully you did. Right, because typically if you don't have the supercharger, you could raise the track up, right, potential energy, and that turns into kinetic, and the car goes around, and then friction, it stops. But if you have this enclosed track, right, and you have the supercharger, and as long as those 6D batteries last, right, those cars will go around there ad infinitum, right? Is this your understanding of how the universe works? Say this track is the universe. We've got an automobile, and the only way it can go around is that it needs this intervention. It needs a supercharger. Is that your view of the universe? Does it need something to keep it going? Or has God ordered the world to be able to do what it does? Intelligent design movement says there are deficiencies in the natural order of things that requires a divine designer to come in and complete it. Microtubules, the flagellum of a bacteria, blood clotting, all these different irreducibly complex processes that can't, they say, come about in a gradual, stepwise natural selection process. It's a supercharger view of the universe. God has to come in and act here. God's not acting anywhere else. God's acting here. And we can see the thumbprint of God and things. God had to do this, and it couldn't be a natural cause. So this is very susceptible to what was mentioned prior this week, the God of the gaps. That if there's an ignorance about the cause of something, we attribute it to God. And then science, which is pretty good at figuring out things, scientists who are pretty good at figuring out things, give a natural cause for it, and all of a sudden, your God has just disappeared, as we saw with Paley. I think the intelligent design movement is just Paley revisited in the 21st century. It's reducing God to a natural cause in the universe. It's saying that God is acting here. They might say that God acts somewhere else, but you lose that sense. You lose the sense of the wonder about the world by saying, I'm just going to focus on those microtubules. That shows God's existence, as opposed to the microtubule itself and the organism existing. So this God of the gaps, a univocal view of God, you lose God's wisdom as you focus on God's power to do something. We could also talk about the new atheists, right? Daniel Dennett, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, who's now dead, who critique fundamentalistic Christians. They critique Paley, they critique the intelligent design movement, and I think rightly so. I think we should rightly critique Paley, and I think we should rightly critique the intelligent design movement. But I think the new atheists, is there anything new about the new atheists? And I don't think there really is much new about them in terms of their content. The way they do it is different, right? It's all about glitz and glamour and fancy YouTube sites. So I'm going to do a little bit of history. St. George Jackson of Art, 1827 to 1900, was a convert to Catholicism. He was a comparative anatomist and one of the greatest of his day. Over in England, he had studied under Richard Owen and also Thomas Huxley. He, in 1871, wrote On the Genesis of Species, that his objections to Darwin based on comparative anatomy. Darwin takes seriously these critiques. And in this Chapter 7 of the final and sixth edition of The Origins of Species in 1872 responds to Mivart's critiques. He receives an honorary doctorate from Pope Pius XI, or the Ninth, in 1876 for his scientific work and as a defender of the faith. And it's Mivart who focuses on human evolution as well and gives us what will be handed down through the next person I'll talk about, Father John Zahm, who was a Holy Cross priest here at Notre Dame, and what goes on with Humani Generis in 1950 and with John Paul II in 1996. And that is the dual origin of the human person. That evolution accounts for the evolution of the body, but God immediately creates the human soul. Right? That begins with Mivart. It's picked up by this man, Father John Zahm. We have a Zahm Hall on campus. He was a physicist. He taught physics and chemistry here. He's considered the American Mivart. And in 1896, he writes this book, Evolution and Dogma, where he attempts to reconcile evolution and theology. It gets published in Italian eventually, and it comes to someone, I think it was a Dominican, who didn't like it and turns it into the Holy Office. And so it was never put on the index, but Zahm withdrew it from publication, right? But in 1896, right, Darwin's 1859, this is an era where Darwinism is in a nadir. There's no mechanism to explain natural selection. It's a black box. There's other competing theories of how things work. One of the problems with natural selection was blending inheritance, that's you're not going to get, if you have tall and short plants, why don't you always just end up with medium-sized plants, right? There's no Mendelian genetics yet to be able to give us that answer. So the science of the day is pointing against natural selection and other reasons. But also, Zahm, who accompanied Teddy Roosevelt for a time down the Amazon, is writing about the atheists of his day, people like Haeckel, and trying to separate out an atheist philosophy and materialism from the science of the day. And so he'll write, it was announced with the loudest flourish of trumpets that evolution is subversive of all religion and of all belief in a deity. Right? This is what Haeckel is promoting. Materialists, atheists, and anarchists the world over loudly proclaim that there is no God because they would have it. Science had demonstrated that there is no longer any reason for such a being. Evolution, they claim, takes the place of creation. An eternal, self-existent matter and force exclude an omnipotent personal creator. Ready to glance at Haeckel, Vogt, Büchner, and others is sufficient proof of radical and rabid are the views of these advanced thinkers. You could just substitute in for Vogt, Büchner, and Haeckel, Dawkins, Dennett, Harris, and Hitchens. It's the same, exactly, a little more flowery language here, but it's the exact same. Because you have a natural cause of evolution, you no longer need a creator. Or you can even apply it to Hawking, Stephen Hawking, right? We no longer need a creator. He specifically responds to Paley. To Paley, as to the older school of natural theologians, God was the direct cause of all that exists. To the evolutionist, and he's also going to be thinking about himself as an evolutionist, God is the cause of causes, right? Causa causorum, of the world and all it contains. Right? Everything about primary cause and secondary cause. God is the cause of everything. God administers the material universe by natural laws and not by constant miraculous interventions. Right? It's not the supercharger view of reality. God is the cause of everything, and through secondary causes that natural law gives a description of, and I would agree with Professor O'Callaghan that laws don't cause anything. Laws are descriptive, they're not prescriptive. They describe the natures of things. And God administers the world, right, providentially through these secondary causes. It's not God acting here and there and not in between. God's acting everywhere. God's the cause of your leg being healed when the doctor sets it. God's the cause of that, but there's also natural functions in your body that are doing it. So the old atheist, I was going to talk about this. We got an announcement, an email that there'd be this this test of the morning. So we can just talk over that. I was going to forewarn you about this, but I forgot. So he's talking about divine and natural causation. The old atheists, I'm going to note as oats. They conclude that, well, maybe I'll have to, it's hard to. It only goes on for 20 minutes, so it's. They, the old atheists, conclude that because, forsooth, they understand how a thing is done, that God did not do it. No matter how wonderful, how beautiful, how intimately complex and delicate has been the machinery which has worked, perhaps for centuries, perhaps for millions of ages, right, deep time, to bring about some beneficent results, if they, the atheists, can but catch a glimpse of the wheels, its divine character disappears. If you have some mechanism, if you have some natural cause to explain it, the divine cause goes away. Right? It's their view of God as natural and divine causes are in competition with one another. It was there in the 19th century. It's there in the 21st century. Nothing is different between these atheists and the atheists of today, the new atheists. Right? As long as you get a natural cause, you've eliminated the divine cause. But that presumes that primary and secondary causes are in competition with one another. That God's a univocal, God acts on the order of nature, and God's a transcendent cause. It would indeed seem that the sole aim and purpose of a certain school of modern scientists is to discover some means of evading the mystery of creation. For they do not only deny creation, but also deny its possibility. So great indeed is their hatred of the words creator and creation, that they would, if possible, obliterate them from the dictionary and consign all works containing them to eternal oblivion. Right? That could apply to Dawkins and Hawkins as much as it did to Haeckel. Right? There's nothing new about the new atheists. The oats are the old atheists, one might call the gnats the new atheists. Maybe I'll skip over these. Ted Peters is a Lutheran theologian. Marty Hewlett's a biologist, used to be at University of Arizona down in Tucson. And they have a book where they talk about Paley's arguments, intelligent design movements, and this conflation between design and purpose. And I'm just going to skip over that for time purposes. To get into our next section, so that's Paley, intelligent design, and the new atheists, so section 3. And now we're going to move into section 4, divine providence and chance, that I just want to go quickly through, in some sense, to get to the human evolution. So just some statements. I'm just going to have a couple slides of statements about either scientists, primarily scientists, or one philosopher who talk about evolution and its incompatibility with theology and purposiveness of humans being around. So Jacques Monod, back in 1970, I think it was, 1970, wrote the book Chance and Necessity. Even today, a good many distinguished minds seem unable to accept or even understand that from a source of noise, natural selection alone and unaided could have drawn all the music of the biosphere. Right? Noise, natural selection alone, that you get all this music. The universe was not pregnant with life, nor the biosphere with man. Be interesting to see, to bring him in conversation with Karen and see what they think about that. Our number came up in the Monte Carlo game. Is it any wonder if, like the person who has just made $1 million at the casino, we feel strange and a little unreal? So it's just by chance that humans have come about. We've won the lottery ticket. We've won the Monte Carlo. The universe is not pregnant with life. I'll talk about that. So this is Jacques Monod. It's just noise and chance, no purpose. Here's Daniel Dennett, part of the New Atheists, philosopher. Darwinism dissolves belief in a God and any sense of divine purpose, design, or intentionality to the world, and especially to human life. And then Dawkins, return to Dawkins, River Out of Eden. The world exhibits those properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither cares nor knows. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. Right? There's something about musical metaphors that these people like. Noise and music of the biosphere. And I'm going to contend that, I've taken this out of some other talks. The other talk that I gave yesterday, I was going to use the word, if anybody's been to Tenebrae during Holy Week, this prayer, night prayer, where the church gets sequentially darkened and there's just one candle left and the candle is carried out. This is usually like Holy Thursday or Good Friday where this happens, and the light goes out of the room and there's darkness and there's this huge noise throughout the church. We do it here in the Basilica on Thursday night at like 11 o'clock. And there's this strepitus, it's called, right? This noise. And I think the New Atheists, and right, there's this strepitus naturae, there's this noise of nature. And I want to put that in contrast to St. Bonaventure's musical image, that creation is a Carmen Dei, a song or a poem of God. Right? How do we see the world? Do we see it just as this noise of nature, or do we see it as a Carmen Dei? So a couple more. Stephen Jay Gould, O'Callaghan talked about this, I think, a little bit, right? If you rewind the clock, contingency fills us with a new kind of amazement that we ever evolved at all. Replay the tape 1,000,000 times from a Burgess beginning, right back 500 some million years ago. Burgess was the rock formations up in Canada. And I doubt that anything like Homo sapiens would ever evolve again. It is indeed a wonderful life. It's wonderful because it wouldn't happen again. It was just the contingencies of life were arranged to make it bring about that one time. This was from my evolutionary biology book that I used here as an undergrad in 1989. The utterly impersonal mechanistic nature of the mechanisms of evolution seems to be so difficult to grasp and so repugnant to those who believe that all things exist for a purpose that meanings have frequently been read into evolution that neither Darwin nor modern evolutionary biologists have intended. Least of all, despite popular conceptions, can evolution be conceived of as being directed toward the emergence of the human species. That seems to be directly in contrast to God creates man and woman. God takes the dust of the earth. God does something intentional. I could have Professor Baglow recite Pope Benedict's homily about you are loved, you are willed into being, something along those lines, right? Right? Seems to be directly in contrast to this. I have a holy card with that quote on it. So if you're a biology student at Notre Dame or in your high schools and you read this textbook, this is a science textbook. Is this science? No. Or George G. Simpson, a paleontologist, Meaning of Evolution, 1949, man is the result of a purposeless and materialistic process that does not have him in mind. He was not planned. Right? That doesn't seem to be a scientific statement. So let's just talk about law. And Karen's talks, Professor Erberg's talks, right? Is there life on other planets? Is there intelligent life on other planets? If there is intelligent life on other planets, what does it do to these statements? Say there's at least one other planet that has intelligent life on it. Say there's 1 million that have it. What would it do to these statements? It would seem to contradict it. Because this is saying human life just comes about once. It would never happen again, do it 1 million times. We have one datum point of life in the universe. You can run no statistical test. You can come up with no law with one event. It's unique, and unique events are not explainable by a law. We have no law of life. If we found life on other planets, we could begin to come up with a law of life. Maybe there's ways that life works. Maybe there's a way that matter, as Hume says, does things. But right now we have no such thing. Stephen Jay Gould, replay the tape 1 million times, you won't get humans again. Simon Conway Morris, paleontologist at Cambridge, has written several books. And he says, if you replay the tape, you're going to get things that swim. You're going to get things that fly. He thinks you'll get human beings. You'll get mammals, he says. You'll get humans. Might not look exactly like us, but he draws upon a biological reality, convergent evolution. So the camera eye, he says, has evolved 6 times independently. Now there's questions about whether there are deeper origins that account for that. But if you think about cacti out in the southwest, and if you go over to Africa and to the Namib Desert, they don't have cacti over there. They have different kinds of plants. But if you're growing in hot, dry conditions, xeric conditions, X-E-R-I-C, dry, hot conditions, evolution is going to arrive at a common solution to how to conserve water. Right? Recessed stomata underneath the plants, you get leaves reduced to spines. Right? It's a common solution, independent origins to it evolutionarily. Evolution converges on a common solution. Right? We've seen this with analogy, right? Insects fly, birds fly, bats fly. Right? Things fly. There are physical constraints to reality, and evolution is constrained by that. But it comes up with common solutions. And so Conway Morris is using that convergent evolution to say, yeah, you play the tape, you're going to get things like we have now. You'll get swimming things and flying things. You'll get thinking things. Leon Cass wrote a book, Toward a More Natural Science, Biology and Human Affairs. And he talks about, in a world, should we be surprised in the world that is, he talks about, let us provisionally say that the origin of sensitivity was due to chance. But is it due to chance that sensitivity was preserved, or that it began to flourish? Or that if in a sensible world, sensing beings would be at home in it? Ought we be surprised, should we regard it as an accident that in a visible, odorous, and sounding world, the powers of sight or smell or hearing, once they appeared, should have been preserved, magnified, or perfected? Likewise with intellect. However accidentally intellect first appeared, is it surprising that it should have been preserved in a world of cause and effect, past and future, means and ends, all of which can be brought to consciousness and used to advantage in being endowed with memory, a sense of time, self-awareness, and the ability to order means to ends in sensing the future? If it is an intelligible world, is it surprising that an intelligent being, once one appears, will be at home in it? Or to put it in the less complete terms of survival, will be likely to survive and flourish? Is it not only not surprising, is it perhaps even necessary that such a world will be hospitable for the maturation of soul? And so I think that ties in with Conway Morris's, right? In a world that's sensible, you're going to get sensing things, and those are going to be preserved through natural selection. They're being selected for. We live in an intelligible world. Wouldn't it make sense to get an intelligible being? What about matter and how matter works? We have Stuart Kaufman and the study of complex systems, and you can get natural, spontaneous, law-like source of order beyond natural selection. whether it's protein folding or bilayer lipid membrane formation or spindle apparatus. Right? All these things are part of these complex systems. It produces order naturally. It's self-organizing. Just throw out Thomas Nagel, right? This book, Mind and Cosmos, right? A self-avowed atheist. He says, intelligence is a counterexample to the law that natural selection explains everything. Great advances have been made in the physical and biological sciences, he says, and it's only been made possible by excluding mind from the physical world. Reductive materialism cannot account for mind, he says. We need a new start on more comprehensive understanding that includes mind. So we think there's a natural teleology. He's still going to deny God, but he thinks there's some kind of natural teleology in the universe, in matter. There must be a cosmic disposition to the formation of life and consciousness. Right? So this is an atheist talking about the insufficiencies of what he sees in natural selection. So just insert here O'Callaghan's talk about the randomness of an event doesn't mean that the process as a whole is random, right? The casino always wins. I ask my students, if you want to make money, would you rather go to the casino as a player, or do you want to own the casino? And you want to own the casino. Now you might be really good and lucky, but overall, right, you want to be the casino. All right, how are we doing? I'm just going to skip over this. I was going to talk about this word almighty, omnipotentum, pantocrator. So in the creed, when we talk about God Almighty, it's not just God is just all powerful, right? He's the pantocrator, which has a sense of God just not only creates the world, but God governs it. He rules it. Right? It's a sense of he's involved with it. It's not just a deistic God that creates it and lets it go. Right? It's a God that rules and governs. So I just wanted to put that in. So this is from the International Theological Commission. They wrote a document called Communion and Stewardship that I highly recommend. Maybe you've read parts of it. I don't know if this was part of the assignments. But many neo-Darwinian scientists, as well as some of their critics, have concluded that if evolution is radically contingent, Stephen Jay Gould, materialistic process driven by natural selection and random genetic variation, then there can be no place in it for divine providential causality. According to the Catholic understanding of divine causality, true contingency in the created order is not incompatible with a purposeful divine providence. That God not only creates things, but God creates them to happen and establishes the way it happens. That God creates things to happen by necessity, or God creates things to happen by chance. And I would just throw this out there. Is chance a cause? Thomas is going to say not per se, it's an accidental cause, but it's not a cause. Chance doesn't cause anything. He uses an example, if you bury, some pirate buries it, well, it was a pirate, but Jack Sparrow buries a treasure. 200 years later, you're digging in your backyard, you come across that treasure. You discover that treasure by chance. There was no cause of it. You're digging, and somebody buried that thing there 200 years ago. There's independent causal lines that intersect. So I just want to throw that out there to just say chance is not a proper cause. So we should get away from that. And the chance is a part of the natural order. Nothing happens by chance for God. Or God's the cause of that chance event. So chance doesn't preclude God. So we have about 15 minutes left before. Then this will be just that paragraph 69 again. Further, in the Catholic perspective, neo-Darwinians who adduce random genetic variation and natural selection as evidence that the process of evolution is absolutely unguided are straying what can be demonstrated by science. Right? We've kind of all agreed to those statements that I showed earlier. Right? It's just because it's natural selection, the events, these mutations might be random. Right? Even Dawkins doesn't think that evolution is completely by chance. Right? He thinks natural selection is taking chance events and it's doing something with it. But just because the events are random doesn't mean the whole process isn't a part of God's providence, directing things, right? Divine causality can be active in a process that is both contingent and guided. I've often wondered if I should write an article about the origin of species. Couldn't we think about writing one about on the end of species? To what end are they directed? Give it kind of a purpose. So let's talk about human evolution. In some ways, this is where a lot of the questions come in. What about us? Right? So Darwin, after most people know his 1859 book, The Origin of Species, right? But in 1871, he writes The Descent of Man and Selection in Relation to Sex. It's all about sexual selection and about human evolution. And Darwin extends natural selection to provide an all-encompassing evolutionary explanation of rationality, human rationality, ethics, social life, culture, religion, by derivation from more elementary features and behaviors found in other organisms. Right? He's going to have a sense that human behaviors, the human mind and intellect, are homologous to our primate friends. Alfred Russel Wallace, right, the contemporary of Darwin, co-founder of evolution by natural selection, doesn't think so. He doesn't think that natural selection gives a fitting account of human higher functions, as we call it. Darwin says, you're killing our child. Mivart, St. George Jackson Mivart, in his book on the Genesis of Species in 1871, he's going to say that he's going to follow Russell Wallace and say natural selection could only account for the physical properties of the human frame, but mentality was autonomous from Darwinian principles. And that's where he comes up with this dual origin of man. In that Mivart wants to provide a completely naturalistic interpretation of humans, that there are homologous anatomical structures. Oh, I'm sorry, this is Darwin, right, in his Descent of Man. Let's go back. Right, so what Darwin wants to do is completely provide a naturalistic interpretation of who we are. That there's homologous anatomical traits, therefore there's homologous mental traits. That the body of an ape has physical traits structurally similar to ours. The intelligence and behavior of an ape, ours is somewhat similar. There's a physical and mental continuum. Right, so we can see some of this. Maybe this will be time to show some videos that are fun and make us think about who we are. So the first is a behavior. This is fantastic. Frans de Waal is a paleontologist. I think he's South African, studies primates, primatologist, and he shows this video.
So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does. And she gets a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber. She tests the rock now against the wall. She needs to give it to us. And she gets cucumber again.
All right, so that's it. I think who doesn't think of a 4-year-old or even us in our worst moments? I hope that doesn't keep playing. Let's see if we can turn that off. All right, so the next one is a little bit longer, but fascinating. It's about chimpanzees. You find scientists up in trees, you ever want to find a priest, you just go into a church, right? If you see a movie, that they're always some just praying all day in a church or something. So, what's our place in this, in the history of humanity? the biologists, the new atheists are going to tell you there's no point to us. We're just here by chance. But Scripture gives us a different story of that. We are here for some intentionality. Right, so here's just a Newsweek example. This is to just art, just how much art influences us, right? So just most people are given this Caucasian view of Adam and Eve, right? Newsweek, or the picture I showed the other day. This is from a cathedral in Gallup, New Mexico. So how do these two fit together? We're made in the image and likeness of God, but we have this phylogenetic history, connection with other hominins and the rest of the world, the rest of the natural world. So Cardinal Ratzinger gave a series of homilies in this church in Munich when he was the Cardinal Archbishop. And they've been recorded, right? You may know of this book, In the Beginning, I think it's called. And there's 4 homilies. And I use excerpts of that in my class because it's just a wonderful way to think about. He says natural science can give us this theory of evolution. Right? It describes the biological development. But it can't explain where the project of humans comes from, our inmost origin, our particular nature. But the Genesis story, right, Scripture, tradition, gives us this overarching project of God. It's the story of the dust of the earth and the breath of God. It explains what we are, explains our inmost origin. It casts light on the project of who we are. But it doesn't explain how humans came to be. Right, for the great project, it's not chance and error. It points to creating reason and intelligence. The human being is a divine project. Natural science, right, explains how the tree of life grows in its branches. We're not a mistake. We're willed. We're the fruit of love. So the International Theological Commission, this Community and Stewardship, paragraph 70, the next one after 69 that we looked at, Catholic theology affirms that the emergence of the first members of the human species, whether as individuals or in populations, represents an event that is not susceptible of a purely natural explanation and which can be appropriately be attributed to a word I don't like, to divine intervention. So I would have advised them to use a different word, the divine action or divine cause, but I wouldn't call it intervention. And so let's just talk about what science and Scripture have in common. And that is that there's one origin of humankind. Right? In the beginning, God created humans, male and female. God creates us out of the dust of the earth. Everyone proceeds, or there's one origin to humankind that Scripture tells us. Science has come to points to the same truth. There were 2 competing models. There's one now that has taken the day in terms of where humans arose from evolutionarily. So this is in millions of years, or years ago, 50,000, million, 2 million Homo habilis. So there used to be one model, was the multi-regional model, that Homo erectus comes out of Africa and goes through into Europe and Asia and Australia. And there's interbreeding, and across all of those places, humans emerge. Homo sapiens emerges across these continents. In that model, there's not a common origin to humankind. Right? There's a polygenetic origin to humans. The best biology of today points to the out of Africa model, that Homo erectus comes out of Africa and goes to different continents. But then Homo sapiens emerges later out of Africa and populates those places. Right? And these disappear. That's the evidence points to that today, which corresponds to the scriptural and Christian view that there's one origin to humankind. I've got about 2 minutes left before I open things up. I just want to talk about mitochondrial Eve and Y chromosome Adam. And it's important that let's just explain what this is. So each cell in our body has about 1,700 mitochondria, right? The mighty mitochondria, right? The power plants of the cells. They have their own DNA. It's thought that these are endosymbionts, that these were once free-living bacteria that got cut up into a eukaryotic cell, and now they live endosymbiotically. And so chloroplasts in plants have their own DNA. Mitochondria have their own DNA. It's a circular DNA. It's about 1,600 base pairs, 37 genes on it or something. 16,000 base pairs, right? Circular. And you only get this from your mom because the ovum has the mitochondria, the egg, the sperm contributes only DNA, nuclear DNA. So everybody in this room only gets your mitochondrial DNA from your mom and her from her mom. And so you can track back, if you take the mitochondrial DNA of people on the planet, it actually tracks back to a common ancestor who is the mother, the ancestor of all the mitochondrial DNA that exists on this planet. That's mitochondrial Eve. But that Eve, mitochondrial Eve, is not the Eve of Scripture. Because she got her mitochondrial Eve from somebody else, right? She inherited it from her mom. And so there's people above her. But there's also people on the same plane as her. And we can think about this. Each of us has 2 parents, 4 grandparents, and 8 great-grandparents, unless there's incest or something, right? So I get nuclear DNA, right, which is 3 million base pairs, 70,000 genes or so, right? I get my nuclear DNA from 8 great-grandparents. But I get my mitochondrial DNA and my 4 siblings, we all get that from 1 great-grandmother. I have 4 great-grandmothers and 4 great-grandfathers. I have 8 great-grandparents who have contributed to my genetic reality. But there's only one who's given me my mitochondrial DNA. These are genealogies. They're genealogies of a gene. And I can get all sorts of genes from other people. So mitochondrial Eve is that person. You can trace back, if you estimate a mutation rate, which is open to revision, you can estimate when mitochondrial Eve lived. And it comes out to be about 150,000 years ago in Africa. You can do the same thing with Y chromosome Adam, that there's some figure, some man, he's not the only person in that generation. Now this comes out to be a different number than 150,000. Sometimes it's 80,000 years ago, sometimes it's 200,000 years ago. They didn't live at the same time. So just to be aware of that, but I think it's also pointing to another aspect of this is with population genetics, you can estimate with gene genealogies, it's called coalescence theory, and you can estimate what's the population of organisms of that population. How many individuals are there when that ancestor existed? And all these different tests indicate that it's about 10,000 individuals. Which makes sense. Everything we know about how evolution works is that, right, individuals don't evolve. Right, populations evolve. Right, it's a change in allele frequency over time in that population. So what science is telling us is that human origins, there's a population of about 10,000 individuals. It's never any less than that. Now, I don't think there's any biologist using a biological species, understanding what a species is, who can tell us how does one species become a second species? At what point does that actually take place? And if we can't do that for earthworms, if we can't do that for weevils, how are we going to do that for humans? I would just recommend just to think about, because then we can think about what's our relationship to Neanderthals, right? Perhaps our Homo heidelbergensis. And I just watched a video last night by Stephen Mithen. This guy. And if you go to this, Is the Human Mind Unique? And I can send this link around. And he gives it, there's like a 24-minute talk. But he's going to go and talk about Neanderthals. And what are the comparisons and differences between us and Neanderthals. And he's going to say there's 8 things that we had a lot in common with. Maybe so this is all Stephen Mithen. This is not me anymore. Close evolutionary relationships. There's some interbreeding. About the same brain size, similarly in vocal tracts. I'm just flying through this just because I want to leave time for questions. Complexity of stone tool use, geographic extent. They existed from about 300,000 years ago until 30,000 years ago. They hunted, they had group cooperation, planning and trust, social complexity. But what they don't have is that they had a confined cultural homogeneity. They didn't change over 300,000 years. There's archaeological digs that what happened at the bottom level, the oldest, is not much different from what happened more recently. They get replaced by us very quickly, and there's an absence of unambiguous evidence of visual symbolism by Neanderthals. So for 300,000 years, there's pretty much the same level of culture. Just in 200,000 years for us, we do this. There's stone tools, they don't get needles and things. They just have, they remain at one level, pretty much. I thought this was fascinating when he pointed this out. Neanderthals, this is the ice ages over the last 350,000 years. And so the warm parts are these peaks, and the ice ages are the troughs. And so we come about, right, about 100,000 years ago. At the first warming, we developed farming. He wonders, why didn't Neanderthals develop farming? They had lots of warm points to come up to. And so he just points to that as some of the aspects of what differentiates us from, he doesn't think they had symbolic use or language. So maybe with that, I'll just end there just to give an example of what's our relationship to our closest, one of our closest ancestral hominins. And leave it at that, and we can talk about evolution and faith. So thanks.
Okay, time. We have about 7 minutes for questions. Are there questions on this side? You have a question from the online? Okay, let's go to them first. I'll bring this one over here. I'll bring this one over here, and then you guys can pass it around on this side to halfway through, and I'll be on the other side with the other one.
Thank you, Father Terry. I have a couple of questions. I might have to go through the first one had to do, I'm going to go backwards. The first one had to do with you possibly commenting on Roger Penrose and Penrose number. What should we make of it? Are you familiar with it? What should we make of it?
So I know I've read about Penrose and Penrose numbers, but I'm not calling it to mind, and I'm going to have to pass on that for now because
Okay.
I'm not prepared to answer that question.
Okay. The second one had to do with the intelligent design. Do people in ID perhaps misunderstand Aquinas' distinction between essentially ordered series, the hook and the chain, and the chandelier, or accidentally ordered series, the hand that holds the bat that hits the ball?
So I'm going to just go back and draw upon what Hewlett and Peters say. And in their book, they make a distinction between design and purpose. Aquinas uses the example of an arrow that is shot. Right? It's got some goal. It's got some direction because it's headed towards some end that's intentional. Right? It acts with purpose. Because of the purpose, you conclude that there's an intelligence behind it, that God governs the universe. Right? So Aquinas is trying to figure out what's the purpose for which the arrow has been fired. Hewlett and Peters will look at the design argument as confusing design and purpose. These chairs are all designed. Right? But that's distinct from its purpose, right? To sit in. But it has a design. It has a complicated structure. And so they see intelligent design as seeking to find out who made the arrow rather than what's the purpose for which the arrow is going. Right, so the purpose for nature is discerned only with the larger picture when we see the archer and the target. And to see the purpose, we must see the target. So I don't know if that would help with that connection with Aquinas and those images that were being used. There's one right in front of you.
I had a question about the multi-regionalism versus the hypothesis that that modern science now supports. What if the evidence had pointed towards multi-regionalism? Like, how, just as a thought experiment, like, how would we respond to that from a theological perspective?
Well, I don't know if I want to deal with a speculation. Like, what if the Earth? What if? Yeah, I mean, I don't know if it's worth. Yeah, I don't know.
And that might be a moot, like, that might be a moot point. Like, that might not actually be a question that is worth asking for, I don't know, since we have.
So what if
Revelation.
humans arose at different points would? I mean, this all gets down to the question of original sin, right? I mean, this is the main theological import of all this. Because Christ has come to redeem humankind. And also to note about original sin, because I think this question would impinge on original sin, is, remember, original sin is kind of a parasitic doctrine. For 1,000 years before the New Testament, the Jews had Genesis. They didn't have an idea of original sin. Right? It's a Christian doctrine. Their idea, as I understand it, is that there are inclinations to good or evil, and that's what Genesis 1 is explaining. But you only get an idea of original sin once you get the resurrection, and the incarnation, the resurrection, and the Paschal mystery. That it's looking back that Christ has come to redeem all, which then means that, well, all must be in need of redemption. And so how does that redemption take place? Christ is human and he's redeeming humans. And then this will raise the question of, is a single origin to humankind, right? Monogenism, as you may know, or polygenism, is monogenism intrinsic to the dogma of original sin? And that's an active debate right now. Right? This is where we need theologians and scientists to think about these things. Pope Pius XII, of Humani Generis, says, I don't see how it's in no way apparent how polygenism, multiple origins, right, if you have multiple families, right, 10,000 humans, it's in no way apparent how that corresponds to original sin. Right, that we all inherit. Remember, original sin is nothing we commit, it's something we inherit. We're only guilty of original sin to the extent that my hand is guilty of hitting somebody on the head. Right? It's because I'm a part of the body, I'm a part of the one humanity. So I think it would get into that question.
Anybody over here, this side? No? Any more over on the other side?
Yes.
Time for one more question.
I'm back on.
Yeah.
Well, there's a
we'll
question
make
out here,
yeah.
but coming down.
Well, I'm just continuing to think about this in light of the conversation that we had yesterday about extraterrestrial life and the incarnation. Because with original sin and the way that it's inherited, I was talking last night about whether it's inherited, like whether it has to be inherited by generations or whether it can be inherited across space as well. Because then that affects like the question of the incarnation and extraterrestrial life. Back to our question yesterday about whether original sin here would affect original sin on other planets, and therefore whether redemption here would affect redemption on other planets.
So I just had something that's slipping out of my mind. So the origin of original sin, right, originates with, Augustine gives us the terms, original sin. And there's two senses of original sin. There's the originating sin and then there's the originated sin. So for him, Adam and Eve originated, and then we inherit what is originated. So there's those two senses. He's in these battles with Pelagius and freedom, and so the church defines it as it's not by generation, it's by generation and not by imitation. But I think that, and I know Dr. Barr has actually thought a lot about this in incarnations, and he gets into questions about whether there be multiple incarnations or not. But that's a different question. So what's the extent of, and I know that we're at time, but Ratzinger, Pope Benedict will talk about the situation in which we find ourselves. Would you, Brother Guy Consamano, who was the original scheduled presenter on the physics part, has written a book, Would You Baptize an Extraterrestrial? I don't know if you talked about that, and he said if she asked. So, yeah, I think there's a, I guess this presumes, is there sin? And this is the book that Professor Baglow talked about, the second in the Space Trilogy of C.S. Lewis. This English philosopher, English philologist is trying to keep Eve, the Eve of Venus, from falling. So the question is, would there be sin on other planets if there's intelligent life? Is there necessarily sin? I think we'd have to ask that question. If there is, does we think that Christ is the King of the universe and his redemption is... So I don't know. These are questions that I don't have a good answer for. And maybe we can talk more in the breaks and things. Yeah. But I mean, they're wonderful questions to think about. Is what is the relationship of some Martian or ET, right, to redemption?
I'll make a quick commercial in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, he may talk
so, in the first book of the trilogy that C.S. Lewis writes, called Out of the Silent Planet, he goes to a place where there are three different intelligent species, none of whom have fallen. Right? That's another great place to think imaginatively about this. In a sense, I'm going to talk more about this when we go, and we're kind of going over time, and everybody needs a break. So I'll wait till I get to my presentation, and if it doesn't sufficiently answer questions that remain, we can pick them up at the end of that one. So, well, this is Father Terry's last presentation. We're very thankful that he's been with us all this time.